Picture this. You're 19 years old. You've just been married off to a British duke you barely know, and now it's your first Christmas away from home. But instead of your family's overheated Fifth Avenue mansion with its excessive decorations and even more excessive food, you're sitting in a literal medieval castle where the temperature inside is basically the same as outside. Your new husband is emotionally distant at best. Your mother-in-law looks at you like you're a particularly disappointing piece of furniture, and everyone keeps talking about traditions that seem designed specifically to make you as uncomfortable as possible. Welcome to Consuelo Vanderbilt'S first Christmas as the Duchess of Marlborough, where the only thing colder than Blenheim Palace was the reception she got from her new family. This is the story of how American heiresses discovered that marrying into European aristocracy meant trading their warm, chaotic, over-the-top American holiday celebrations for freezing stone fortresses, bizarre Victorian customs, and in-laws who made it abundantly clear that your millions were welcome, but you personally were merely tolerated. It's about culture shock, homesickness, and the particular kind of misery that comes from realizing you've signed up for a lifetime of Christmases that feel more like endurance tests than celebrations. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Consuelo Vanderbilt spent the early weeks of December 1895 in a state of low-grade dread that she couldn't quite articulate to anyone, least of all her new husband, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, who seemed entirely unbothered by the approaching holiday, and for that matter, entirely unbothered by most things related to his wife's emotional state. They had been married exactly 3 months. 3 months during which Consuelo had discovered that being a duchess was less like the romantic fantasy her mother had sold her on, and more like being a very well-dressed prisoner in a very large, very cold cage. And now Christmas was coming. Her first Christmas as a married woman, her first Christmas away from New York, her first Christmas in England, and she was discovering that the British approach to holiday celebration was as alien and uncomfortable as everything else about her new life. Back home in New York, Christmas at the Vanderbilt mansion had been an exercise in American excess that would make modern influencers weep with envy. Her mother Alva had approached holiday decorating with the same aggressive ambition she brought to everything else, which meant their Fifth Avenue palace had been transformed into something that looked like Santa's workshop had exploded inside a jewelry store. There were trees, multiple trees, each one bigger than the last, each one dripping with ornaments that cost more than most families earned in a year. There were garlands and ribbons and enough holly to deforest a small forest. There were presents stacked so high you needed a ladder to reach the top, wrapped in paper imported from Paris and tied with silk ribbons that cost more per yard than some people's rent. The house had been heated to tropical temperatures because Alva Vanderbilt believed that if you were going to be wealthy, you should be wealthy and warm, and anyone who suggested otherwise was clearly doing wealth wrong. Christmas dinner had been a multi-course extravaganza that lasted approximately 4 hours and involved dishes that seemed designed specifically to demonstrate how much food you could afford to serve. There had been oysters and terrapin soup and roasted turkey and glazed ham, and about 17 different kinds of potatoes and vegetables imported from God knows where, and desserts that arrived on platters carried by footmen who probably needed back surgery after hauling around creations that weighed more than small children. It was excessive, it was over the top, it was absolutely ridiculous. And Consuelo, who had grown up with this level of holiday chaos, had taken it entirely for granted until she didn't have it anymore. Blenheim Palace, she was discovering, approached Christmas with the kind of restrained, tradition-bound solemnity that the British seemed to believe was appropriate for everything, including activities that were supposed to be fun. The Duchess Dowager, Charles's mother, who had made it clear from day one that she considered Consuelo's American millions adequate compensation for her son's hand in marriage, but found Consuelo herself somewhat lacking, had explained the holiday schedule with the kind of stern formality you'd use to outline military operations. There would be church services. There would be tenant gatherings where Consuelo was expected to distribute gifts to the estate workers with appropriate ducal graciousness. There would be formal dinners with specific seating arrangements that reflected complex social hierarchies Consuelo still didn't fully understand. There would be shoots where the men went out to kill things while the women stayed inside, doing whatever it was British aristocratic women did when their husbands were murdering birds. Everything would be done according to tradition, according to what had been done at Blenheim for generations, according to standards that apparently left no room for things like personal preference, or, God forbid, actual enjoyment. "We do not," the Duchess Dowager had said with a sniff that conveyed approximately 17 layers of disapproval, "decorate excessively. Such displays are rather American." She had pronounced American the way you might say contagious disease, and Consuelo had felt her face burn with embarrassment and homesickness and anger she couldn't express because duchesses, apparently, were supposed to accept criticism of their homeland with gracious dignity. The temperature situation at Blenheim Palace was, Consuelo decided by the first week of December, a deliberate form of torture disguised as aristocratic tradition. The palace was enormous, 200 rooms spread across 7 acres of building that had been constructed in the early 1700s, when apparently no one had considered that humans might actually want to be warm indoors. The walls were 3 feet thick in places, made of stone that seemed specifically designed to absorb cold and radiate it back at any living thing foolish enough to be nearby. The ceilings were so high that any heat generated by the inadequate fireplaces simply floated upward into decorative oblivion, never to benefit actual humans at ground level. The windows were massive and single-paned and let in drafts that could extinguish candles from across the room. Her bedroom, which she did not share with her husband, because aristocratic couples apparently believed that maintaining separate sleeping quarters was a sign of sophistication, rather than what it actually was, which was weird and sad, was so cold that she could see her breath in the morning. She slept under approximately 40 pounds of blankets and still woke up shivering. Getting dressed required the kind of courage usually associated with polar expeditions, and she had taken to having her maid bring her clothes to the bed so she could change under the covers like some kind of Victorian turtle. Bathing was an ordeal that required advanced planning and significant mental fortitude, because even with hot water brought up by servants, the bathroom itself was so cold that you were basically freezing before you even got wet. "One gets used to it," Charles had said when she'd mentioned, delicately, carefully, in the tone of someone trying not to sound like a spoiled American, that perhaps the palace was somewhat chilly. He had said this while standing in the library, wearing approximately 4 layers of wool clothing plus a coat, which suggested that no, one did not actually get used to it. One simply learned to dress like you were preparing for Arctic exploration, even though you were supposedly inside a heated building. The British, Consuelo was learning, had a perverse relationship with comfort that seemed rooted in the belief that suffering built character, and that anyone who wanted to be warm or comfortable was somehow morally suspect. They viewed central heating with suspicion, as though maintaining a consistent indoor temperature above freezing was a sign of weakness or possibly American vulgarity. They seemed to believe that cold was good for you, that it prevented illness, that it built fortitude, that it separated the strong from the weak. This was, Consuelo thought, while shivering through yet another breakfast, where the eggs had started to congeal before she could finish them, completely insane. But insane or not, it was tradition, and tradition at Blenheim trumped everything, including basic human comfort. The American heiresses who had married into British aristocracy before Consuelo had tried to warn her. She remembered now with the particular clarity that comes from realizing you should have listened to advice you dismissed as exaggeration. Jenny Jerome, who had married Lord Randolph Churchill and become Winston Churchill's mother, had been frank about the temperature situation. "Bring warm clothes," she had said. "Bring more warm clothes than you think you'll need. Then bring twice that amount. You will never be warm again." Consuelo had laughed, had thought Jenny was joking, or at least exaggerating for effect. She understood now that Jenny had been speaking literal truth, the kind of truth that only made sense once you'd experienced it yourself. May Gaulet, who had become the Duchess of Roxburgh by marrying into the Scottish aristocracy, had been even more direct. "The castles are unheated," she'd said. "Not poorly heated, unheated, as in same temperature inside as outside, except somehow colder, because at least outside you're expecting it." Consuelo had nodded politely, had not really believed this was possible in 1895 when central heating existed and wealthy people could certainly afford it. She understood now that the issue wasn't whether they could afford heat, they absolutely could, but rather that they considered choosing to heat your home adequately to be somehow unmanly or un-British or representative of the kind of weak character that made you unsuitable for aristocratic life. Christmas preparations at Blenheim began in early December with a series of meetings where the Duchess Dowager outlined expectations and Consuelo tried to take notes while simultaneously trying to figure out why everything had to be so complicated. There would be specific decorations, but only in certain rooms, and only of certain types, and absolutely nothing that could be classified as excessive or showy or American. There would be a tree in the Great Hall, but it would be decorated according to tradition, which apparently meant it would be tasteful to the point of invisibility, nothing like the glittering monstrosities Consuelo was used to back home. The gift-giving situation was particularly complex and involved what seemed like approximately 47 different categories of recipients, each with specific protocol about what was appropriate to give and how it should be presented. There were gifts for family members, which had to be carefully calibrated to reflect both affection and appropriate social distance. There were gifts for house servants, which had to demonstrate generosity without being so excessive that it suggested you were trying to buy their loyalty, or, worse, that you didn't understand proper boundaries between classes. There were gifts for estate tenants, which had to be practical and useful, but also symbolic of the paternalistic relationship between aristocrats and tenants that Consuelo found increasingly uncomfortable the more she learned about it. There were gifts for various social acquaintances, which had to strike an impossible balance between thoughtful and impersonal, generous and appropriate. "One must be careful not to give anything too personal," the Duchess Dowager explained, with the kind of emphasis that suggested Consuelo had already committed this error in her mind and needed correction. It suggests a familiarity that may not exist. Equally, one must not give anything too impersonal, as it suggests indifference. It is a delicate balance that comes with experience and breeding. Consuelo heard the implication clearly. She lacked both experience and breeding, at least the right kind of breeding, the kind that came from generations of British aristocracy rather than from American millionaires whose money was barely 2 generations old. Her father's fortune had come from railroads and steamships and investments, which meant it was new money, tainted money, the kind of money that could buy a title but couldn't buy the instinctive understanding of British social rules that came from being born into this world. She was always going to be slightly wrong, slightly off, slightly too American in ways that people like the Duchess Dowager would notice and judge and find lacking. The tenant gift distribution was scheduled for December 23rd and involved Consuelo standing in the freezing Great Hall for approximately 3 hours while estate workers filed past to receive their gifts, usually food baskets or cloth or other practical items, and to have a brief interaction with the Duchess, where she was supposed to demonstrate gracious interest in their lives while maintaining appropriate social distance. It was, Consuelo realized with creeping horror, basically a receiving line, except instead of celebrating anything, she was distributing charity and receiving gratitude from people who depended on the estate for their livelihoods and who therefore had no choice but to be grateful regardless of whether they actually were. You must smile, but not too broadly, the Duchess Dowager coached. You must seem interested, but not overly familiar. You must be gracious, but maintain dignity appropriate to your position. Remember that you represent the family now. How you conduct yourself reflects on all of us. The pressure of this was almost unbearable. Back home in New York, Consuelo had been wealthy and privileged, certainly, but she hadn't been responsible for representing anything beyond her own family. Here, she was the Duchess of Marlborough, and that title carried weight and expectations and responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. Every interaction was scrutinized, every word was analyzed, every gesture was interpreted as representative of her fitness for this position she hadn't wanted and definitely hadn't been adequately prepared for. The actual tenant distribution went about as well as could be expected, which is to say it was awkward and uncomfortable, and Consuelo spent 3 hours smiling until her face hurt, while making polite conversation with people who clearly found her as foreign and strange as she found them. They were polite, certainly. You couldn't be rude to a duchess even if she was American, but there was distance there, wariness, the sense that she was an outsider who hadn't earned her position through anything except having a rich father willing to pay for a title, which was, Consuelo reflected bitterly, completely accurate, even if it wasn't particularly fair to her personally. One woman, elderly and bent and clearly struggling with the cold that seemed to bother no one except Consuelo, looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. "You look frozen, Your Grace," she said quietly. "These old places are terribly cold, aren't they? Not like what you're used to, I'd wager." Consuelo felt a sudden rush of gratitude for this small acknowledgement of her discomfort, this tiny moment of human connection in what had been 3 hours of formal performance. "They are rather cold," she admitted, keeping her voice low so the Duchess Dowager wouldn't overhear and deliver another lecture about maintaining appropriate dignity. "I'm still adjusting. You'll get used to it eventually," the woman said, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe this. "Or you'll learn to wear more petticoats. That's what we do. Layers, Your Grace. Lots and lots of layers." Christmas Eve brought house guests because apparently celebrating quietly with just immediate family wasn't done in aristocratic circles. Various relatives and social connections arrived throughout the day, each arrival requiring Consuelo to be present in the freezing entrance hall to greet them with appropriate warmth. Ironic, given that nothing about Blenheim Palace was warm, and make small talk while servants dealt with luggage and arrangements. The guests were uniformly polite and uniformly distant, treating Consuelo with the kind of careful courtesy you'd show to something slightly exotic that you weren't entirely sure how to interact with. Several of the women were other American heiresses who had married British aristocrats, and Consuelo had hoped this would provide some sense of camaraderie or shared experience. Instead, she discovered that these women had mostly adopted British attitudes and seemed almost aggressive in demonstrating how thoroughly they'd adapted to their new world, as though any acknowledgement that they too had once found all this strange and uncomfortable would undermine their current position. They spoke in British accents that sounded slightly affected to Consuelo's ear. They discussed British social matters with insider knowledge that excluded her. They made occasional comments about Americans, as though they themselves were no longer part of that category, as though they'd transcended their origins through successful assimilation. "You'll adjust," one of them told Consuelo with a patronizing smile that made adjustment sound both inevitable and somewhat demeaning. "We all found it strange at first, but then you realize that the British way is actually superior in most regards. More civilized, more refined, less vulgar." Consuelo bit back the response that British aristocrats living in unheated castles and shooting birds for entertainment didn't seem particularly civilized to her. She was learning that survival in this world meant keeping such observations to herself, smiling politely, and saving her actual thoughts for the diary she'd started keeping as a record of her misery and as insurance, that if she went insane from cold and loneliness, at least there would be documentation of what had driven her there. Christmas Eve dinner was a formal affair that lasted approximately 4 hours and involved more courses than seemed physically possible for humans to consume. They started with oysters, because nothing says Christmas like raw shellfish in an unheated dining room, and progressed through soup, fish, poultry, roast beef, game, various vegetables that had been boiled into submission, and approximately 17 different desserts arranged on the sideboard like edible architecture. The conversation was carefully managed by the Duchess Dowager, who directed topics and ensured that nothing too controversial or too personal was discussed. They talked about the weather. They talked about sports. They talked about people Consuelo didn't know and social events she hadn't attended and political matters she didn't understand. Charles sat at the head of the table, miles away from Consuelo, in a seating arrangement that reflected social hierarchy rather than marriage, and participated in conversation with animation he never showed when speaking with his wife. He was charming and witty and engaged when talking to these people, these aristocratic relatives and social equals who shared his background and understood his world. With Consuelo, he was distant and formal and barely present, as though their marriage was an unfortunate business arrangement he had to maintain but didn't have to enjoy. After dinner, the women withdrew to the drawing room because men and women separating after meals was apparently necessary for civilization to continue, and Consuelo found herself trapped in conversation with the Duchess Dowager and several other older women who seemed determined to educate her about proper behavior, proper attitudes, proper everything. They discussed servants and how to manage them. They discussed social obligations and how to fulfill them. They discussed other aristocratic families and their various scandals and shortcomings, always with the kind of judgmental certainty that suggested they themselves were above such behavior. Of course, American girls often struggle with the expectations, one woman said, not even bothering to lower her voice or pretend Consuelo wasn't sitting right there. They're not raised with the same standards. So much emphasis on money, so little on breeding. It creates certain difficulties. The Duchess Dowager made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been indigestion. One can only hope that proper guidance and sufficient time will address the deficiencies. Consuelo sat frozen, not just from the temperature, though that was certainly a factor, trying to maintain the gracious smile she'd been told was required, while internally screaming at the casual cruelty of being discussed, as though she were a problematic piece of furniture that needed refinishing. This was her life now. This was what she'd signed up for when she'd agreed, or rather, when she'd been coerced by her mother to marry Charles. These people judging her, finding her wanting, treating her like a necessary evil who came with a large enough dowry to overlook her fundamental inadequacy. When the men finally joined them, after what felt like 17 hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Charles didn't seek out Consuelo or even make eye contact with her. He gravitated toward a group of men discussing hunting and stood there laughing and animated, while Consuelo watched and wondered if he would have been this indifferent if she'd been British, if he'd married someone from his own world who understood all these unspoken rules and didn't require the kind of patience he clearly didn't possess. Christmas morning began with church service at the estate chapel, which was somehow even colder than the main house, an achievement Consuelo wouldn't have thought possible if she hadn't experienced it herself. She sat in the family pew, wearing every warm garment she owned, plus a fur coat, and still spent the entire service shivering, while the vicar droned on about peace and goodwill, and other concepts that seemed notably absent from her current life. The tenants and estate workers attended as well, filling the pews behind the family in an arrangement that reflected strict social hierarchy, everyone knowing their place, everyone maintaining appropriate distance between classes. After church came the traditional Christmas meal, which was turkey and plum pudding, and various other dishes that were probably delicious, but tasted like dust in Consuelo's mouth because she was so homesick she could barely swallow. She kept thinking about Christmas back home, about her mother and her brothers, about the chaos and excess and, yes, vulgarity that she'd taken for granted and now missed, with intensity that felt almost physical. She'd been gone from New York for barely 3 months, but it felt like years, felt like she'd been exiled to another world where nothing made sense and nobody understood her, and she was expected to just adapt and be grateful for the privilege of being miserable in a castle. The gift exchange was anticlimactic. Charles gave her a bracelet that was expensive and impersonal and clearly selected by someone else, probably his secretary or possibly the Duchess Dowager, because it reflected no knowledge of her taste or preferences. She gave him cufflinks she'd agonized over for weeks, trying to find something that was thoughtful but not too personal, expensive but not ostentatious, appropriate but not boring. He thanked her with the same polite distance he might show to a shop clerk handing him a package. There was no warmth, no affection, no acknowledgement that they were married people exchanging gifts on Christmas morning, rather than business associates concluding a transaction. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a blur of formal activities and mandatory socializing. There was the obligatory walk through the grounds, during which everyone pretended the freezing temperature was bracing rather than what it actually was, which was miserable. There was tea service with more small talk and more careful navigation of social expectations. There was an evening gathering where someone played piano and everyone sat around pretending to be entertained, while actually just waiting for an acceptable moment to escape to their freezing bedroom. Consuelo went to bed that night, feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. She was married, she was a duchess, she was living in one of the most famous palaces in England, and she was absolutely, crushingly isolated. Charles had said goodnight to her in the hallway, with the same polite formality he'd shown all day, then disappeared into his own rooms, apparently unbothered by the fact that his wife had just spent her first Christmas away from everything familiar, surrounded by people who viewed her as inadequate, in a house so cold she could barely function. She sat at her dressing table while her maid brushed out her hair, looking at her reflection and trying to recognize the person staring back. 3 months ago, she'd been Consuelo Vanderbilt, heiress to one of America's greatest fortunes, with her whole life ahead of her. Now she was the Duchess of Marlborough, trapped in a loveless marriage, living in a freezing palace, surrounded by people who would never fully accept her, spending Christmas missing her family with intensity that felt like grief. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" her maid asked, using the title that still sounded foreign to Consuelo's ear. "No, thank you," Consuelo said, and climbed into bed under her mountain of blankets, in her freezing room, in her new life that felt nothing like what she'd imagined marriage would be. The week between Christmas and New Year's brought more house guests, more formal dinners, more activities designed to demonstrate aristocratic leisure while actually requiring significant effort to maintain appropriate behavior throughout. There were shoots where the men went out to kill things, and the women stayed behind doing embroidery or reading or whatever it was British aristocratic women did with their time. There were walks through the freezing gardens, where everyone admired winter landscaping that looked to Consuelo like dead plants covered in frost. There were card games and piano recitals and dinner conversations that somehow managed to last for hours while covering absolutely nothing of substance. Consuelo discovered that British aristocratic Christmas celebration was essentially one long performance of class distinction and social hierarchy, with every activity designed to reinforce who was important and who was less important, and where everyone fit in the elaborate pecking order. The house guests were ranked by title and social position, with seating arrangements and activity scheduling reflecting these rankings with mathematical precision. The Duke and Duchess of whatever outranked the Marquess and Marchioness of something, who outranked the Earl and Countess of elsewhere, and so on down the hierarchy until you got to people like Consuelo, who were technically high-ranking but also tainted by American origins and therefore occupying complicated position in the social structure. The Duchess Dowager presided over all of it, with iron control disguised as gracious hospitality, making sure everyone understood the rules and followed them appropriately. She was, Consuelo realized, basically running a very elaborate, very expensive theatre production, where everyone had assigned roles and any deviation from the script was unacceptable. As the new Duchess of Marlborough, Consuelo was supposed to be learning her role, absorbing the expectations, preparing to eventually take over this position when the Duchess Dowager finally stepped aside, which, based on current evidence, would probably happen sometime around never. New Year's Eve brought yet another formal dinner, followed by a gathering where everyone stood around at midnight, pretending to be excited about the calendar change while actually just going through motions because tradition demanded it. Charles stood next to Consuelo when the clock struck 12, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her, or take her hand, or make some gesture, acknowledging that they were married, and this was their first new year together. Instead, he raised his champagne glass in general toast to the room, turned to shake hands with the nearest male guest, and left Consuelo standing there, feeling invisible. She lasted another hour before excusing herself and escaping to her bedroom, where she finally allowed herself to cry, with the kind of desperate, hopeless sobbing that she'd been holding back for weeks. She cried for her family back in New York. She cried for the life she'd left behind. She cried for the future that stretched ahead of her. Decades of this coldness and loneliness and isolation. She cried because she was 19 years old and trapped in a marriage with a man who didn't love her, living in a country that didn't want her, surrounded by people who tolerated her money while despising everything else about her. Her maid found her still crying an hour later, and in violation of every rule about appropriate servant behavior, sat down next to her on the bed and held her hand while Consuelo sobbed. "It gets easier, Your Grace," she said quietly. "Not better, perhaps, but easier. You learn to manage. You find ways to cope. You build a life, even if it's not the life you wanted." Yes'm. This was, Consuelo thought through her tears, possibly the most depressing comfort she'd ever received, and also the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived in England. The house guests finally departed in early January, and Consuelo felt relief that was almost dizzying at no longer having to perform perfect Duchess behavior 18 hours a day. She was still cold, still lonely, still trapped in a loveless marriage, but at least she didn't have to do it in front of an audience that was constantly judging her performance and finding it wanting. Charles, freed from holiday social obligations, essentially disappeared into estate business and his own pursuits, leaving Consuelo to figure out what the Duchess was supposed to do with her time when not entertaining guests or fulfilling social obligations. The Duchess Dowager provided a list of appropriate activities: charitable work with estate tenants, correspondence with other aristocratic women, overseeing household management, practicing accomplishments like embroidery or piano. The list was deeply depressing and also completely inadequate as a life plan for someone who was 19 and intelligent and capable of far more than decorative gentility. Consuelo tried the charitable work and found it patronizing and uncomfortable, a performance of noblesse oblige that did nothing to address the actual systemic poverty affecting the estate tenants. She tried the correspondence and found it tedious beyond belief, full of formulaic pleasantries and careful navigation of social hierarchy. She tried the household management and discovered that the Duchess Dowager had no intention of actually ceding any real authority, so Consuelo's involvement was purely symbolic and changed nothing. By late January, she was desperate enough to write to her mother, something she'd been avoiding because she didn't want to admit how miserable she was, and didn't want to give Alva Vanderbilt the satisfaction of knowing that her daughter's arranged marriage was exactly the disaster Consuelo had predicted it would be. But isolation and misery finally outweighed pride, and she wrote a carefully worded letter that tried to convey her unhappiness without actually saying anything that might be read by others or used against her later. Alva's response, when it came several weeks later, was characteristically unsympathetic. She had married Consuelo off to secure a title and social position, and she considered the transaction successfully completed. That Consuelo was unhappy was unfortunate, but ultimately irrelevant. "You are a duchess now," Alva wrote. "You represent our family in the highest circles of British society. Your personal feelings are less important than your position and the opportunities it creates. Learn to adjust, learn to be grateful, learn to fulfill your duties with appropriate grace." It was, Consuelo thought, while burning the letter in her fireplace, one of approximately 17 fireplaces in her rooms that collectively generated enough heat to warm a space roughly the size of a closet. The most Alva Vanderbilt response imaginable. No sympathy, no understanding, just relentless focus on social position and family advancement, with Consuelo herself merely a game piece moved around the board to achieve strategic objective. February brought no improvement. If anything, the winter weather made everything worse, with snow and ice and winds that somehow made Blenheim Palace even colder than it had been at Christmas. Consuelo spent most of her time in her rooms, wearing multiple layers of clothing, sitting as close to the inadequate fire as possible, and trying to figure out how to survive the next 60 years of this existence. She made one attempt to discuss her unhappiness with Charles, choosing her moment carefully, approaching the subject delicately, trying not to sound like she was complaining or criticizing, or being the kind of difficult American wife that British aristocrats probably told horror stories about. He listened with polite attention that suggested he was already mentally composing his escape, then said something about adjustment taking time and everything becoming easier with experience, and left before she could say anything else. It was clear that he had no interest in her emotional state, no curiosity about her experience, no desire to make their marriage anything beyond the business arrangement it had always been. He'd gotten what he wanted, access to Vanderbilt millions to restore Blenheim Palace and maintain the estate, and Consuelo's happiness, or lack thereof, was simply not his concern. By March, Consuelo had developed coping mechanisms that would serve her for years: emotional numbness, strategic withdrawal, careful performance of expected behaviors, while maintaining inner life completely separate from external reality. She learned to be the Duchess of Marlborough publicly while remaining Consuelo Vanderbilt privately, though even that distinction became harder to maintain as time passed, and the demands of her position wore away at whatever sense of self she'd managed to preserve. She also learned to appreciate small victories: a warm day when the palace was almost comfortable, a letter from home that reminded her she'd once had a different life, a moment of genuine human connection with a servant or tenant that broke through the usual social barriers. These tiny moments of relief became precious, hoarded memories that she could return to during the worst times, evidence that perhaps life wasn't entirely unbearable, even if it was mostly unbearable. Years later, when people asked Consuelo about her first Christmas at Blenheim Palace, she would smile and say something polite and vague about adjustment and tradition and learning British customs. She never told them the truth, that it had been one of the loneliest, most miserable experiences of her life, that she'd cried herself to sleep most nights, that she'd seriously considered running away, except she had nowhere to run to and no resources that weren't controlled by either her husband or her mother, that she discovered that being a duchess meant being gilded cage, and the gilding didn't make the cage any less confining. Other American heiresses had similar experiences, variations on the same theme of culture shock and homesickness, and the devastating realization that they'd traded one kind of life for another without fully understanding what they were giving up. They'd all been sold the same fantasy: marry a title, become nobility, gain access to aristocratic society, live in castles and estates, wear tiaras and jewels, be someone important. The reality: freezing palaces, loveless marriages, hostile in-laws, rigid social hierarchies, isolation from everything familiar, had not been part of the sales pitch. May Goelet wrote to Consuelo sometime that winter, one of the few letters that felt genuinely honest rather than carefully composed performance. "I spent my first Christmas at Flore's castle wanting to die," she admitted. "It was so cold, I thought I might actually freeze to death. And honestly, dying seemed preferable to spending another hour at dinner listening to my mother-in-law explain everything I was doing wrong. I cried every day for the first year. Then I cried every week for the second year. By the third year, I only cried occasionally. I'm not sure if that counts as adjustment or just emotional exhaustion." This was the reality that nobody talked about publicly. The truth hidden behind carefully maintained facades of aristocratic contentment. American heiresses had bought their way into British aristocracy, but the price was higher than just their father's money. They'd paid with their autonomy, their comfort, their connection to everything familiar, their emotional well-being. They'd become living bridges between American wealth and British status, and like most bridges, they bore heavy loads while receiving little appreciation for the weight they carried. Consuelo would spend 11 years in that first marriage before finally escaping through divorce. Scandalous, socially devastating, but ultimately necessary for her survival. She would remarry eventually to a Frenchman who actually seemed to like her as a person. Rather than viewing her as a walking bank account, she would find happiness, though it would take decades and cost her more than anyone should have to pay for the crime of being born to wealthy parents with social ambitions. But that first Christmas at Blenheim Palace, that cold, lonely, miserable holiday season, surrounded by people who viewed her as necessary evil, would stay with her forever as a reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd gained, and whether the trade had been worth it. Spoiler alert, it hadn't been. But by the time she'd figured that out, she was already trapped, already committed, already the Duchess of Marlborough, whether she wanted to be or not. The snow fell outside her windows that winter, covering the formal gardens in white that looked beautiful from a distance and were absolutely miserable up. Inside, Consuelo sat in her inadequately heated rooms, wearing multiple layers of clothing, writing in her diary about homesickness and loneliness, and the particular kind of misery that comes from having everything society says you should want, while desperately missing everything you actually need. She was 19 years old, a duchess, trapped in a castle that would never feel like home, married to a man who would never love her, living a life that would never satisfy her. And it was Christmas, supposedly the season of joy and goodwill and family connection, which just made the isolation and unhappiness that much more devastating.